Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 17th of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. Gales coming in, snow in Scotland. I believe there's some sort of warnings to do with the weather that have gone out already. How did we survive years ago when we didn't get all of these government warnings, Mike?
Well, we mustn't have. We mustn't have is the answer.
Okay, we'll leave it there.
We're going to break the rules and start with the sun. And the only reason we're starting with the sun is because this is where former Armed Forces Minister Mike Penning was, who he was speaking to. So he has told the Sun that the UK is on the verge of no longer being taken seriously around the globe, according to the Sun, because defence has been, quotes, cut to the bone. He said that the SAS and the SBS, the Special Air Services and the Special Boat Services, are exhausted. They're leaving in ever larger numbers because they're being deployed on missions almost continuously. He said that Royal Navy frigates are tracking Russian submarines. That are tracking Russian submarines can only stay at sea for a maximum of 6 days because they're so short-staffed. He said that the Navy no longer has enough spare ships to mount a pirate fighting operation off the coast of Africa. And he said that troops have been sent to Eastern Europe to fend off the Russians with light desert vehicles, Brian, because it's so hard to deploy tanks. He said the army is too small. An army of 82,000 doesn't give us enough ready troops to deploy. If numbers go down anymore, we're simply not going to be able to do what the British public expect of us from our NATO and UN commitments to humanitarian missions. If you continue to develop the replacement Trident from the existing budget, he said, that will dramatically affect the operational capability of the three armed forces, particularly the army. And then he said that he wants the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to fund Trident's replacement with a new pool of money that is kept entirely separate from the rest of the military defence's budget. And he said that somebody had to stand up and say enough is enough. We're down to the bone now. So finally, somebody from that might be considered establishment-ish is coming out and telling it as it is.
As it is. I think we've got to give this man credit because it takes some courage to stand up and say these things. And what he has said from all the information that comes into the UK column, this is entirely accurate. The armed services at the moment are being ripped apart. And the other thing we need to mention, I think, is that Mike Penning is one of the very few MPs that actually has given support to the Metropolitan Police whistleblower, John Wedger. We'll be able to tell you more about this later on in the week, but essentially this man was formerly the policing Minister for Policing, and in that role he heard evidence from John Wedger. He was then subsequently to support John Wedger, which so very few other MPs have done. So it does seem that this man, Mike Penning, has got some guts.
And we'll move on to NATO then, because this is the head of NATO, and he is, the head of NATO's military committee, I should say, and he's discussing Georgia and Ukraine in a speech that he gave yesterday. Chairman of NATO Militaries Committee, he opened the 178th Military Committee in Chiefs of Defence session in Brussels yesterday, and he said that today, he said tomorrow, but he meant it is today now because we're getting confused here. But anyway, he said we will start with 2 meetings dedicated to our partners, Ukraine and Georgia, who will inform us of their perspectives of the regional security situation. We will also hear about the status of Ukrainian armed forces development and NATO's substantial package for Georgia. He said that the session covers the NATO's political and military priorities and intent ahead of the Defence Ministerial, which takes place next month, as well as expectations for the NATO summit in July. And he said we will then meet with our wide network of partners to discuss military contributions to security and stability in Europe's southern neighbourhood in the context of NATO's projecting stability efforts. So I have bracketed that on the graphic there as taunting Russia efforts, because that's what it is, Brian.
This is so incredible. We are told repeatedly that Russia is this growing threat, yet all of the movements we see of troops at the moment are NATO forces moving eastward. And coupled with that, as we started off, we've got cuts to British armed forces. So the government says Russia is a growing threat. We might expect more money and more effort to be going into defence, but in fact the exact opposite is happening. And then it gets even more interesting. So let's have a look at this one. The Express, other sources also reporting this yesterday, fury at thousands of UK jobs at risk as Mod to place a $3 billion order with a German firm. Now this is for light but armoured reconnaissance vehicles. The army apparently wants 800 of them. Well, the rate we're going, it'll be one per soldier. But if you have a look back over the last couple of years, this story has repeatedly come to the fore that the British government was going to order these vehicles from the German company Rheinmetall, and this was £3 billion worth of British money going to help the German economy. Just absolutely incredible. It was going to happen, then it wasn't going to happen. Now the Ministry of Defence is saying, well, we're not sure, but it may be that we don't put it out to contract. So what's happening here? I think this is a reality, but they've been found out. Credit to Julian Lewis, Commons Defence Select Committee chairman. He's written to Harriet Baldwin, Minister for Defence Procurement, and he's asked for clarification on whether the MOD would welcome bids for the prime contract from UK manufacturers and whether the department accepts there is a UK industrial capability to build these platforms. It's the last part of that, Mike, which caught my eye, because this man is apparently suggesting, and I think quite right, have we actually got the capability now to build our own military equipment? Because, of course, if we haven't, we're well on our way to not existing as a country.
I'm going to be saying, I'm interested to see whether he gets a response to this, because of course Harriet Baldwin is no longer the Minister for Defence Procurement as from a couple of days ago. And will his letter, his written question, disappear in the changeover between personnel?
Well, we will see. Then have a look at this, which I just regard as sort of duplicitous stuff from David Davis. He says this is a multi-billion-pound contract which will support thousands of jobs, so we should do everything possible to ensure those jobs stay in Britain. At the very least, companies like General Dynamics, based in Wales, should be given every opportunity to compete for the tender to build these vehicles. Given its importance to South Wales, I've already raised the issue with the Defence Procurement Minister, and I'm seeking a meeting with Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson. Well, of course, the big lie is that General Dynamics is not a British company, it's an American company. So this is, let's save a few jobs in Wales, but let's give £3 billion to the US economy. At every stage, British MPs betray the country, stand fast, with the exception there of Mike Penning in today's news. But at each turn, it doesn't matter what party, it's an utter betrayal of the people in this country.
Now, over the last couple of weeks since the new year, of course, we've had a complete change around in the situation over North Korea, Brian. And North Korea picked up the phone to South Korea, the two countries in discussions now, North Korea being invited to the Winter Olympics. My understanding is that the two Koreas will parade in the opening ceremony together. And so we're seeing a major shift in the sort of power base in that part of the world. But you know, Boris Johnson and the Americans as well, not happy about this in any way. So he was in Canada yesterday at a meeting hosted in Vancouver, hosted by the US and Canada, focusing on security and stability in the Korean Peninsula because they're losing their foreign policy efforts to create a war there. So he said there can be no doubt that the crisis in Korea is intensifying. Is he living on some other planet? Because as we see the Koreas talk and things calming down somewhat in Korea, he says it's intensifying. How does he justify this?
Because this is a created situation, Mike, and he knows full well that the global corporate politics, body of politics, is their wish is to intensify the trouble.
Absolutely. So he went on to say we had 20 tests, nuclear tests that is, within the last year, 20 missiles, 2 of which flew over Japan, and 1 testing of a nuclear device. It's very important, he said, and encouraging that the world is not being intimidated or divided by the threat from North Korea. And actually, we have come together, and in Resolution 2397, there was an unprecedented measure of global consensus about what to do and to intensify the political and economic pressure on the regime. Well, while that's going on and they're talking up the crisis, as we mentioned over the last couple of days, of course, in Hawaii, we had this fake warning about a ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Well, it didn't end at Hawaii because yesterday the Japanese did exactly the same thing. Now, in Japan, it is their public television responsibility of the public TV network to push out this type of information. And they sent out a message saying North Korea appears to have fired a missile. The government says seek shelter inside buildings and basements. And then they went on to say a short time afterwards that unfortunately it was a mistake and that they're very, very sorry. Is it a coincidence that all this stuff is going on at the same time?
No, it isn't. This is ramping up fear, I think, Mike. They are desperate to get the population, the world population, more fearful so that the political agenda for world government can be drifted in. But very interesting, isn't it, that the broadcaster in Japan said they made a mistake. Who gave them the information they acted upon?
Well,
or are we in a really scary situation that the broadcasters, when they decide they're going to try and produce a sort of scare pandemic, they simply produce a story which they know is untrue?
Well, they claim to have quoted the government in that. So, but who in the government? That's the question.
So we're now into Japanese defence. We're now into warning for ballistic missile attack. We can't rely on those people because they're making mistakes. We didn't know whether it was a missile or not. Pretty unlikely, I think.
Yes, just as a final point, I would mention that should North Korea fire a missile at the United Kingdom, Brian, and we be at risk, it is up to the BBC to tell us about it, so we should all be able to sleep safely knowing that.
Thank you.
Yes, good. Now, talking about Syria yesterday, we were talking about the fact that the US government seems to be funding a new terrorist army. Alistair Burt, International Development Minister, decided that he had to say something about this today. He's actually Minister for the Middle East now, I think is the specific title. He said that the UK continues to play a leading role in response to the tragedy in Syria. We've committed nearly £2.5 billion to our humanitarian response to the crisis. To translate that, what that means is £2.5 billion effectively supporting terrorism in that part of the world. But anyway, he said, I am alarmed that in spite of commitments to de-escalation, the regime and its backers continue to bomb and shell opposition areas in eastern Ghouta and Idlib. And I would just remind everybody that eastern Ghouta and Idlib are Idlib in particular is the location where all the armed terrorist groups are existing. Eastern Ghouta, as we reported a few days ago, the terrorist groups there, the people that have stayed behind, are firing mortars into other parts of Damascus. He's suggesting that the Syrian regime, the Syrian government, has to continue or is continuing to bomb and shell opposition areas. He's complaining that the government is doing something about terrorism in a country. It's incredible. In recent weeks, he went on to say these regime offensive have killed hundreds of civilians, displaced tens of thousands, and destroyed hospitals and other civilian infrastructure. Changed the record. They've done nothing of the sort, and I want to see some evidence, Mr. Burt, that you have for making those statements. But the bottom line is £2.5 billion into Britain's so-called humanitarian response in Syria, which has been supporting terrorist groups.
But the truth is coming out, and we need to manipulate the media a bit more.
Well,
that's the line.
That's absolutely right. So this is Southern and Eastern Europe, Southeast Europe and Turkey. And UNESCO feels that it needs to help build trust in the media in Southeast Europe and Turkey. They have launched an in-depth survey about journalism education in Southeast Europe. But what they say is that as there is a clear decline in the civil society's trust in media in Southeast Europe and Turkey, UNESCO is seeking to reverse that trend through a project entitled Building Trust in Media in Southeast Europe and Turkey. Together with partners and with financial support from the European Union, the project seeks to strengthen freedom of expression, access to information, free, independent and pluralistic media, ensuring that journalists and media are key drivers for democratic, sustainable and peaceful development in the region. So what they're saying is that they want to support and make journalists and the media key drivers for change in the region.
Well, that's what BBC Media Action are all about.
So this project is being implemented in Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia and Turkey, as well as Kosovo. So there you go. I think perhaps UNESCO would be much better deployed doing something about the British media and perhaps the media in the United States as well, because as we mentioned, with trust being so low at the moment, perhaps there should be some effort to survey the qualities of journalism education in these countries.
Well, you would have thought that on that statistic that 83% of the British population don't trust the BBC, there'd be some form of investigation. But apart from the Daily Mail reporting that survey, general silence. Well, if there's trouble and we need to manipulate the media, a man who, of course, has got all the assets is George Soros. But some interesting reporting here from Breitbart. Soros pledges renewed fight against the dominant ideology of nationalism. He also says that the EU is on a verge of breakdown. Well, let's have a look at the detail. Soros's Open Society's foundations once epitomised the optimism about the spread of Western-style democracy. That's what we're reporting, isn't it, Mike? The wars overseas, that's all Western-style democracy. It says here, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Financial Times described the scrutiny the global progressive bodies experiencing amidst a wave of patriotism and populism and the wilting attraction of the leftist agenda. They're getting a little bit worried that people are standing up for their countries. We're not talking Nazi style nationalism here. We're talking about people simply recognising that they quite like their nation states. But Soros thinks this is a threat, this is nationalism. And he alluded to the collapse of the USSR, and he told the left liberal newspaper is deja vu all over again with one big change. The dominant ideology in the world is now nationalism. There it is again. It's the EU that's the institution that's on the verge of a breakdown. So Soros is clearly very worried. He's being scrutinised and watched by people in Eastern Europe, certainly, because that's where he's doing a lot of damage. What's Soros's solution? Well, he's recently, fairly recently anyway, transferred a mere $18 billion across into his Open Society foundations and all of the agencies, and he says that they've got to get going with global political activism. So if you can simply hand out $18 billion, you can cause trouble more or less anywhere you like. And we just bring this one in because he admitted something in the interviews. He said, we were not involved in the actual fighting. That's a reference to Ukraine, Macedonia and Georgia. That's against our guidelines and principles, but we were supporters of the fighters, and that was also during the Maidan. So this man pumping the money in claims he's not helping the fighters. Well, he says he's helping the fighters, but he's what, not buying them weapons?
Oh, well, I don't think he went that far.
I think somebody else would buy the weapons. There would be an intermediary.
Right, okay, but it's his money.
I would guess.
Possibly. I've chosen the Telegraph here for this story, but Newsweek, a whole bunch of other newspapers and media outlets covering this. And this is the allegation that Wendi Deng, who is the ex-wife of Rupert Murdoch, is possibly maybe a Chinese spy. And the Telegraph here says she is the glamorous former wife of a multimillionaire who is mixed with the great and the good of Westminster and Washington life, but Wendi Deng Murdoch, once married to media mogul Rupert Murdoch, is now facing questions about whether she used her high-flying connections for more than just socialising. Apparently, British intelligence officials, Brian, discussed with the FBI whether her friendship with Tony Blair, for example, was a cause of concern. Well, there were allegations it was a bit more than a friendship, but was it a cause for concern? Who knows? Where is this going, you may ask? The Telegraph goes on to say it was prompted by fears amongst the US intelligence community that Ms. Murdoch had used her connections to lobby for the Chinese government. The approach reportedly was made after claims that Mr. Blair and Ms. Murdoch had a romantic relationship. US officials also warned Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, about his friendship with Ms. Murdoch. According to US media reports, they were said to have expressed fears that Ms. Murdoch was pushing a Chinese garden project in Washington, D.C., and some feared it could be used for spying. So, and they roll out Michael Wolff, who of course has written this so-called expose on Donald Trump. And Michael Wolff, in a tweet, said that since their divorce, Murdoch has been telling anybody who would listen that Wendi is a Chinese spy and had been throughout the marriage. So this opens a whole range of cans of worms, Brian, but it's pretty clear the target here is Donald Trump. And that now that Russiagate has effectively failed, it looks like they're going to try to create a Chinagate out of this.
It's Chinagate, but it's interesting. We've got a man who's running whatever percentage of Western media, fully involved with a lady who could now be a Chinese spy. How does that work?
Well, we don't need to worry about that. We don't need really to worry about Tony Blair either. We only need to worry about
focus on Trump.
Trump, yeah.
Right. So we only need focus on Trump. Okay.
There you go. So loneliness. Brian, are you feeling lonely?
Well, we do sometimes. I have to say, we do feel lonely sometimes.
Do you?
Yeah.
Right. Well, today, Theresa May is setting out, or has set out, how government is tackling loneliness and combating social isolation. She's announced that the government is accepting a series of recommendations from the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness. And she's going to host a reception at Downing Street to celebrate Joe Cox's legacy and importantly, the work of the foundation and the commission, and highlighting how many people are experiencing loneliness. So if I can understand this correctly, what Theresa May is doing is having created the policy and implemented the policy which broke up communities and made families yeah, over many years and has made people lonely in the first place. Now she is going to say what a great job they're doing in supporting the Joe Cox Foundation, a commission, and appointing a minister for loneliness, Tracy Crouch, who has said that she is privileged to be taking forward the remarkable work done by Joe Cox, the foundation and the commission. This is this just a new order of magnitude of hypocrisy here? It's
getting government at an even lower level, isn't it? We're now down into very vulnerable individuals. The government, don't worry, the government is going to help you. So the people sleeping rough on the streets, I can imagine a lot of them are very lonely. To date, the government doesn't want to deal with those people, but now we've got a loneliness minister, and she is going to she's going to help all these people. It's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. Well, let's move on to something that isn't nonsense, and that is what is happening to the NHS. And very, very interesting to see. Here is the BBC absolutely ripping into the NHS. This is the main block of BBC articles on their website today. Health service hemorrhaging nurses. I'm really sad I can't be an NHS nurse, so we've got a nice embedded video clip. So what is the BBC doing? Well, they're pointing out that something like 1 in 10 nurses are leaving the NHS. Here's the statistics that they've got from NHS Digital themselves. 33,000 leave each year. What a vast waste of money and effort in training and time and resources put into these men and women, and then they leave. So the BBC, very big in the data because it's been given to them, obviously. So this is some of the stuff that they've printed. More than 10% of the nursing workforce have left NHS employment. The numbers of leavers would be enough to staff more than 20 average-sized hospital trusts. So they're putting out all of the doom and gloom. They're reveling in it, Mike. They are absolutely reveling in the fact that the NHS is in dire straits, and we're going to have a look at why. So there's plenty of analysis on the number of nurses leaving, but they do little on the actual root causes of what's going on inside the NHS. So this is blatant and vicious propaganda by the BBC attacking the NHS, and we'll have a little look at how they do this. Here's a couple of screenshots from the embedded BBC video. Former nurse Mary Trevelyan left because of stress and pressure. It made her unwell. And what this lady says in the video, I've heard personally many times from NHS staff. They're working vast hours, 13, 14-hour shifts. There's constant change and turmoil. This all creates enormous stress and pressure on them, and eventually they feel unwell and they're leaving. So what this young lady says to camera seems to me to be pretty realistic. And then let's have a look at what the article says the NHS is doing about this. And we'll bring on Professor Jane Cummings, the Chief Nursing Officer. And what does she say? Well, she says we do lose people that need to be encouraged. We're in the process of bringing in lots of nurse ambassadors that are going to be able to talk about what a great role it is to be able to tell their story, so we can really encourage people to enter the profession and for those in the profession to stay in it.
I mean, this is duplicitous at best, but it gets to the point, doesn't it, that when you see headlines like more people are leaving than are joining, well, that gives the government a good opportunity to say, well, we're employing more nurses than ever. But of course, the government isn't mentioning the fact that they're still not even coping with the number of leavers that there are. But once it gets into the press that people are leaving, that has to discourage new people coming in, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And I have to say, a little while ago, the local Plymouth newspaper, the Evening Herald, said that leaks about defence cuts was affecting the morale of the troops. It wasn't the cuts themselves, it was only the leaks that were doing the damage, you understand. But what's this lady said? That they're not going to deal with the problem. They are going to bring in ambassadors to tell you that the job is actually better than you actually know it is. Yes. This is newspeak. This is groupthink. It's really quite... We're going to encourage people to enter the profession. Well, no, you're not, because people are leaving the profession because of all the problems. So what are they going to do? They're going to introduce masterclasses for all directors of nursing and HR leads. Recognise that at all, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll come on to that. Easy nurse transfer schemes. So you're working in a job, you can't cope with the stress and the profession and the pressure. So not to worry, we'll move you to another position, which will create more turbulence for somebody else. We're going to have nurse mentoring schemes.
That, I presume, is so that it doesn't matter how bad you feel about your job, you're going to have somebody coming in and telling you, don't worry, it's fine.
Don't worry, yeah. You're going to get more awards. Good. So well done for putting up with the chaos and the stress and the pressure. We're going to solve the problem by giving you more awards, and we're going to arrange discounts and benefits at shops and local gyms for
this
you.
would be the shops and local gyms that are opening in the hospitals themselves?
Yes. So
because we're turning hospitals into shopping centres.
So there's a little bit more profit goes back into the failing NHS. I mean, this is complete nonsense when you analyse it. So they're not doing anything that tackles the root cause of the increasing chaos, pressure, stress, and excessive working hours. They don't even talk about it. The problem is with the work staff. So let's have a look at some of the stuff going on in the background, just to make sure people know that UK Column is absolutely on the button with this one. Here we've got NHS England, the Virtual Academy of Large-Scale Change Masterclasses. Wow. So we're not dealing with trouble on the wards. We're not dealing with the chaos the management structure has caused. Here it is, massive, large-scale change, which is the agenda in the first place. And if you look at what Jane's Jane Cummings gets up to. You can have a look at her Twitter page. This is an image that she's tweeted out. Chief Nursing Officer of England Summit 2017. What are they talking about here? It's all the in newspeak: digital change, leadership, reflections, thinking globally, transformation. This is nothing about the care and treatment of people on wards.
Why does a nurse in a hospital, in Derriford Hospital, need to think globally?
Mike, because this is the change agenda being brought into the NHS. And let's have a little look at where this comes from. Now, fascinating series of articles from The Guardian. Thank you very much to the person who emailed it in. I haven't had time to look through all of them, but have a look at this. Margaret Thatcher's role in plan to dismantle the welfare state revealed. It says that Margaret Thatcher and her Chancellor Sir Geoffrey Howe were behind a politically toxic plan in 1982 to dismantle the welfare state, and this is shown in newly released Downing Street documents. And it goes on here to say that the proposals were considered by a cabinet, and there was a massive scaling back, proposal for a massive scaling back of public health services, and this would of course mean the end of the National Health Service. So this is all now coming to the surface in documents, but UK column over the last couple of years has also been showing that there were many documents, this one going back to 1968. It was called After the NHS by a gentleman called Arthur Selden. What was he doing? Warning about the plan to actually dismantle the NHS. We've got this book. I'm sorry, I should have got the date on this one, but I think it's early 80s, The Plot Against the NHS. This is all evidence in plain sight. Even The Guardian said this book was indispensable. We've got this one. People need to pay attention to this, written by Oliver Letwin, Privatising the World. And of course, what's special about Oliver Letwin is that he's absolutely a Rothschild man. So here's the banking interest getting in alongside our public services. And we'll bring in this one, which is really excellent, an email that has been sent through. A gentleman some 7 years ago read the memoirs of Douglas Hurd, and in it he found a very interesting statement. I might have trouble reading this. Here we are. Later, I became a junior ally of Lord Rothschild and his youthful Central Policy Review staff. The CPRS was set up to be the anointed rebel within the system, the grit in the Whitehall oyster, designed to produce a harvest of pearls. It was one of Ted Heath's most striking innovations, the servant of the cabinet, not the Prime Minister. It was fascinating to watch Ted Heath and his cabinet humble themselves at the regular reviews of strategy presented them at Chequers by Victor Rothschild and his team. And what the author of the email said is, what you seem to be implying here, Mr. Hurd, is that Victor had an almost controlling or at least strong influence on Ted Heath and the government policy. So we've got Rothschild banking interests right in at the heart of government. This is now coming to the surface. But if we even look at more recent reports, this is going back to the Cameron era, but here's the Mirror saying David Cameron stepped up plans to sell off the NHS after hiring aid with links to healthcare firms. And of course, many Tory MPs have actually got fingers in the pie of a great many of these profit-making healthcare, so-called healthcare organisations. The evidence is there in plain sight. More of it will come to the surface and we will report it. But let's just remind ourselves how this change agenda works. We've talked about this man many times. Here he is giving a lecture at TED. And what is he talking about? The need for more disruptors in order to destroy the stability of public institutions, to bring in the change agenda, the transformation agenda. And of course, if you, sorry, I've got a little video clip in there, we'll move on past that. I actually emailed this man and said, well, of course, if we disrupt organisations like local government and the NHS, people are going to die. And that is exactly what is going to happen there. So where do these disruptors come from? Well, they come out of large amounts of government-funded money. This is a government agenda. And I better bring in our local MP here, Gary Streeter, because a year ago, I think it was about a year ago, in the local paper, he said this: "I've heard from lots of constituents who have all kinds of ideas that I consider to be untrue, ranging from a secret Tory plan to privatise the NHS to conspiracy theories." So here we've got another duplicitous MP trying to say that blatant Tory plans to destroy the NHS is all fantasy. And if you want to get deeper into this, have a look at the UK Column website with our excellent article by Martin Edwards, NHS Common Purpose Towards a Million Change Agents. This is planned subversion of the NHS, and UK Column is going to be reporting on this over the coming weeks. We are also planning to launch a conference talking about problems in the NHS. So if you're working in the NHS, you're retired from the NHS, or you've got information which you feel could be important to such a conference, please get in touch with us.
Right, data protection bill is continuing its way through Parliament. It's got another Lord's Amendment session today. Last week, of course, last Wednesday, I think it was, they added some amendments to that which would decriminalise people's research into whether so-called anonymised data sets were sufficiently anonymous. And this is pretty important because, well, the NHS is producing copious amounts of data which is being given out to all kinds of people in an allegedly anonymised form, for example. But they amended the legislation to say that that anybody that's investigating whether a data set is actually anonymised or not, that this should not be a criminal offence. They said that the first condition is that the person acted A, with a view to testing the effectiveness of the de-identification of personal data, B, without intending to cause or threaten to cause damage or distress to a person, and C, that reasonable belief that in particular circumstances re-identifying the information was justified as being in the public interest. And there was a second condition that they would disclose what they'd found very quickly within 72 hours of becoming aware of it. The other piece of news from last Wednesday's, we covered it on this programme, of course, last Wednesday's efforts by the Lords on this was that they passed amendments backing the idea that news publishers would have to pay the costs of data protection breaches and also, unless they sign up to a regulator under the Royal Charter system. So this is enforcing Leveson, as it were.
By blackmail.
By blackmail, yes. But under consideration for today is the question of whether any breach of the new Data Protection Act, when it finally becomes an act by government, would cause government departments to be liable, and apparently not. So they want to amend the bill to say that as regards criminal liability, a government department is not liable to prosecution under this act. B, nothing in a previous subsection makes a person who is a controller by virtue of that subsection liable for prosecution under the Act. And C, a person in the service of the Crown is liable to prosecution under the provisions of the Act, but only under a single subsection. So the Data Protection Act, Data Protection Bill continues to move through. Well, one of the other things that happened this morning, Brian, was that, related to this, was a debate in Westminster Hall. It was attended by, I think, about 6 MPs, so heavily attended, as you can imagine. Yeah, about AI and ethics, and of course, big data sets, and particularly anonymised data sets, were a part of that discussion. I just wanted to remind everybody that in the autumn statement last year, in the section on building the new economy, including AI and big data, they said that they were creating a new centre for data ethics and innovation, a world-first advisory body to enable and ensure safe, ethical innovation in artificial intelligence and data-driven technologies. But what was clear from that debate, and what I think is becoming clear from the discussion over the data protection bill, is that actually government doesn't really have much of a clue about the implications of big data, the possibilities, whether it's even possible to anonymize data properly. I don't believe it is. They're creating these centers for data ethics and so on, a whole bunch of new NGOs, and there's no clear strategy for how they're actually going to manage this going forward. I hate to use the word going forward. I've been told off for that before.
Yeah,
not allowed to do that.
A little bit of newspeak there.
Yes.
I just find the moment they talk about ethics, you know that what they're going to be doing will in fact be unethical.
Yes.
So do we trust them to look after our data? No, we don't. Why do they need the data to be able to use it for the new digital society? And I'll just mention that somebody sent us a very interesting article talking about plans to produce a super smart digital section of Toronto where lampposts and street litter bins are all going to have embedded intelligence to keep an eye on people. They said it's Orwellian, but don't worry because they're bringing it in, which was a pretty good way to approach it.
Right. The Local Government Association has published this article, Public, the First Line of Defence to Tackle Modern Slavery Amid Rise in Potential Victims. They're saying the members of the public are the first line of defence in tackling modern slavery and should be aware of the potential to come across modern slavery in their everyday lives. The Local Council Association said latest official figures reveal a shocking increase, 47% in the number of people referred. And they're saying that there are between 10 and 13,000 victims of slavery in the UK. They represent 370 councils. And they're hosting a series of events today. They say large numbers of people are being transported to properties in vans, minibuses, or other large passenger vehicles early in the morning or late at night. People who look as if they're being instructed or coached by somebody else. This is how you identify somebody who's potentially the victim of modern slavery. People who seem to have been deprived of food, water, medical care, sleep, or other life necessities, or who may be bonded by debt or come across as if they're in a situation of dependence. And members of the public who suspect that modern slavery may be happening in their local area are urged to contact the police or local authority who have the duty to report it to the national referral mechanism. Now, just to remind people of the scale of this, these are the stats on modern slavery referrals, and we can see there that domestic servitude, labour, organ harvesting, sexual slavery, and an unknown group. And then if we look at the red bars that are overlaid on top, these are the children that are involved in modern slavery, according to the referrals. Now, these are only referrals, so there are no statistics that I'm aware of at this point that actually provide evidence for how many of those referrals turned out to be genuine. And we've only got estimates for how many people aren't referred, how many people are actually in a state of modern slavery that don't get referred. And I just remind everybody of the scale of the profits in this, multiple billions of pounds of profit in modern slavery, and the scale of the funding for dealing with it is in the order of a few £1 million. So really, the government not taking it very seriously at all in this country. But of course, just to remind everybody, it's not just in this country, because here is Sputnik pointing out that the number of cases in human trafficking, modern slavery in Sweden has reached record highs. It has gone up 30% there. What did we say? 47% in Britain, 30% in Sweden last year. And at the same time, they say an unparalleled number of legal applicants receiving citizen rights in Sweden as a result. And they're saying that, again, children being a key problem here, but people mainly coming from Nigeria, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Cuba, Iraq, Morocco, and Thailand, in that country at least.
Interesting to see in the text there that it says reached a record high after increasing 30% in 2017. If you've got a spike that big, presumably somebody investigates it to say, how can this be happening? It isn't a gradual increase. We've got a massive increase, 30%. there's got to be a significant cause to that, which must be obvious.
Well, I mean, I think I think it's understood what the cause is, but the cause is not being dealt with because the profits are so huge.
Yeah. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of today's news. I'd like to say thank you very much to all our overseas viewers and listeners. France, Germany, USA, Thailand, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia. We know that there are people now across the world watching us. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please pass on the news of UK Column to your friends and colleagues. Spread the word. And I'll just say to our audience in general, many people will actually email into us and say, what do we do about all the things you're reporting? And we will keep saying the basic thing: expose it, talk about it, choose a section that you're interested in, the NHS or defence or schooling, whatever it is, pass the information around, share it with other people, and share UK Column news, because exposure is 95% of the battle. And as we see the evidence for the subversion, the undermining of the NHS, as we see the evidence coming to the surface, that evidence is amazingly powerful in holding the government to account over what they're really doing, for example, with the NHS. So talking, sharing the information, vitally important, particularly as we see the state closing down on broadcasts over the internet and social media such as Twitter and Facebook. That's it for today. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.